Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening. My name is Stephanie Fassler. I'm the International Affairs Director for the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Council, I welcome you to this author series and World Affairs Today program. In 2012, the world was shocked as militant Islamists overtook northern Mali, capturing the ancient city of Timbuktu, instituting Sharia law, and destroying many of the city's cultural and scholarly icons. Many feared they would take the whole country. In January 2013, France intervened in its former colony, stopping an al-Qaeda advance onto the capital. The French military intervention prevented Mali from falling into the hands of al-Qaeda, but the forces also helped to promote stability in the region, preventing the extremists' return. This intervention was fairly quick, effective, and relatively low cost. As we look to combat terror groups such as ISIL, we ask, what lessons can we learn from this intervention? Can these be applied to larger and more entrenched groups? Dr. Christopher S. Chivvis, author of The French War on Al-Qaeda in Africa, will explore the French military's efforts in Africa and what lessons other militaries can draw. Dr. Chivvis is the Associate Director of the International Security and Defense Policy Center and a senior political scientist at the RAND Corporation. He also serves as the adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University's Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies. Previously, Dr. Chivvis has held research positions at the French Institute for International Relations in Paris and the German Institute for the International Security Affairs in Berlin. After working in the Eurasia Security Strategy Office at the Office of Secretary of Defense, he was honored with the Outstanding Achievement Award for the development of strategies and policy implementations for major defense policy issues in Europe and in Eurasia, including NATO-Russia. He also is the author of Toppling Qaddafi, Libya and the Limits of Liberal Innovation, and the EU Civilization Crisis Management, The Record So Far, published in 2010. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chivvis.
Thanks very much, Stephanie. I appreciate it. Grateful for the chance to be here tonight. Appreciate World Affairs Council putting this on. And obviously thanks to all of you for braving this weather and the traffic, which I think is thanks to Mr. Netanyahu, but I won't speculate. In any event, I'm really excited about this book and the opportunity to give you a little bit of a sneak preview into what's in it. This will, I think, be the first of a few book talks that I do over the course of the coming months. So I'm, as I said, excited about getting going here. The book, as Stephanie mentioned, is called The French War on Al-Qaeda in Africa. And it's a book about French counterterrorism efforts in North Africa, and specifically the French intervention that was codenamed Wildcat, or Serval in French, that took place in Mali back in 2013. It deals with three major subjects that I think should be of interest to those of you who are here tonight. First, contemporary French military and defense policy, capabilities, and strategy. France is obviously a key ally of the United States, with a long history in the military field, dating back obviously to Napoleon and earlier than that. And this is in part a study about where French security policy is going in Africa, but also more broadly in the world. Now, second, the book deals with the strategies for military intervention against terrorist groups, whether Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, or Daesh, as I think I'll refer to them tonight, or other Salafi jihadist groups. This is obviously a big problem that we have. I think the history of the last 25 years, from the Balkans to Afghanistan to Libya and Iraq, demonstrates how hard, yet at the same time how critically important it is to find effective intervention strategies. The story of what the French did raises some interesting questions, as Stephanie alluded to, about how we in the United States approach these interventions. Third, and perhaps of most immediate importance, the book is about the spread of Salafi jihadist groups across the Sahel and Maghreb regions in North Africa. This third subject, I think, is one that is grossly underrepresented in current national security debate here in Washington. For obvious reasons, we've spent a lot of time focused on the spread of Daesh across Syria and Iraq over the course of the last 2 years. What Daesh is doing in Iraq and Syria is and should be a major concern, quite clearly, for the United States and its allies in Europe and the region. But Daesh's activities are not limited, as some of you may know, to Iraq and Syria alone. Like al-Qaeda 10 years ago, Daesh also has a global strategy. That strategy involves building affiliates in places that are far and often far from Syria itself. So it seems to me that while we have a good recognition of the problem that exists in Syria and Iraq, outside a fairly narrow group of experts, mostly in the government, the broader policy community and public is a little less aware of how Daesh is expanding elsewhere in the world, especially in North Africa. To give you a sense of the size of this problem, of the Salafi jihadist group's expansion across North Africa, I just returned from Tunisia, where I had the chance to talk with some people who were very tactically focused on the spread of Daesh in Libya. And these guys told me that Daesh now has a significant presence in at least 4 Libyan towns. I think even more worrisome, arguably, than that, they're reportedly building explosive-formed penetrators, or EFPs, in a munitions factory in Tripoli. Now, I don't know how many of you know what EFPs are. I myself actually was not entirely clear. I had to look it up to understand it fully. They're also known as tank killers. They're a kind of advanced improvised explosive device that can be very problematic for conventional forces like our own. So my analysis of this sort of little tidbit of information about what Daesh is doing in Libya right now, is that their strategy in North Africa is to dig in for the long haul. They expect to be facing a military intervention at some point down the road, and they intend to prepare and eventually fight it with everything they have. So this book is about French military operations against al-Qaeda, as I said, not Daesh. But it's important to understand that these groups are very similar. I mean, they're part of the same phenomenon. They draw on the same sources of strength in this region, and they have pretty much the same objectives, even in their methods, even if their methods differ to some degree, with al-Qaeda being somewhat more focused on larger scale, higher profile attacks, and Daesh being more focused on more tactical kind of operations that have proven effective and lower cost for them to pull off. I mean, it's true that on some level these two groups compete with each other. Al-Qaeda's regional commander, Abdelmalek Drukdal, and his Shura counselor in Algeria, whereas Daesh's regional network is commanded from within Libya, and to a certain degree potentially from Baghdadi himself in Syria. But the regional threat posed by Al-Qaeda and Daesh is basically the same, and it's growing, just as is the threat from a host of other smaller jihadi splinter groups like Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia, Ansar al-Sharia in Libya, or al-Murabitun. The objectives, methods, and ideologies of all of these groups are very much the same. So it's the fundamental proposition, I guess, of my book that what the French accomplished against al-Qaeda in their intervention in Mali in 2013 is essential to understanding how we might deal not only with al-Qaeda, but really with all of these groups and the broader problem of Salafi jihadist threats in North Africa. I mean, I think in particular in the United States, we have a little bit, an understandable, but nevertheless a little bit of a tendency to focus on our own wars, sometimes at the expense of learning from the experiences of other countries and of our allies in particular. What the French accomplished against al-Qaeda in Mali is worth special attention because the French managed to strike a really significant blow to al-Qaeda at what was really a pretty low cost, especially when you view that cost alongside the cost that the United States incurred in Iraq and in Afghanistan. So what I'd like to do tonight is to explain the French strategy and recount for you, at least an abbreviated version, of how French military operations on the ground played out. But first, I want to talk just a little bit more about the roots and development of these Salafi groups in North Africa, because I think it's important background. Now, the jihadist group that is at center stage in this book is known as Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. This is an Al-Qaeda affiliate group that emerged around 2006 out of a long-standing Algerian jihadist group that was known as the Groupe Salafiste pour la Prédication et le Combat, or the GSPC for short. Like many Salafi jihadist groups operating today, the GSPC dates back to the Afghan war in the 1980s and especially the early 1990s. Like bin Laden, Zarqawi, and others, lots of the GSPC's members, core members at least, fought together in Afghanistan back in those days. In 2006, the GSPC decided to make itself an ally of Al-Qaeda. They swore allegiance to bin Laden and rebranded themselves as Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or AQIM, as they're normally called. Soon after swearing allegiance to bin Laden, they conducted a series of murderous, coordinated attacks in Algiers, and over the course of the next few years, accumulated considerable wealth, actually, running lucrative smuggling and kidnapping operations in southern Algeria, Mauritania, Niger, and Mali itself. AQM actually made millions of dollars, potentially over $100 million out of these operations by some estimates. Now, these funds obviously were of enormous value to them in recruiting jihadist foot soldiers for terrorist and other operations, for purchasing influence with local governments, and getting the arms that they needed to sort of carry out further attacks. By 2011, that is 5 years after they decided to align themselves with Al-Qaeda, when the Arab Spring hit and the civil war in Libya broke out, AQIM was already a very big regional problem with lots of funds, a well-established structure, clear links to core Al-Qaeda in Pakistan, and multiple branches operating in and around Algeria, to the west, to the east, and to the south. Now, AQIM leadership was widely believed to be in the Kabyle Mountains east of Algiers, but it was AQIM's southern branch that arguably posed the biggest threat. For years, its leader, Mukhtar Belmokhtar, had been operating smuggling and kidnapping operations in southern Algeria, northern Mali, Mauritania, and Niger. For those of you who are not familiar with him, Belmokhtar is one of those legendary figures in terrorist circles in the region. He led the 2013 attack on the British Petroleum facility in Aminas in southern Algeria, and has run a large network across the region for several years. I mean, his success with cigarette smuggling won him the moniker of Marlboro Man, and there have been multiple attempts to take him out, but the success of those attempts appears to have been limited. Indeed, it's unclear whether or not he is at large or whether he was killed in an airstrike earlier this year. Along with AQIM Southern commanders, Belmokhtar established a very strong position in northern Mali. He intermarried and established close familial relationships with the nomadic Tuareg people who inhabit a significant part of northern Mali, Niger, southern Algeria, and Libya. Belmokhtar's strategy was very similar in this regard, I think, to bin Laden's strategy in Afghanistan. Just as bin Laden had used the Taliban to infiltrate and lay roots in Afghanistan in the 1990s, Belmokhtar and other AQIM leaders used the long-standing grievances of the Tuareg people to infiltrate northern Mali and basically set up shop there. Over the course of 2012, Belmokhtar and other AQIM commanders built on these local relationships to set up what was one of, if not the, largest and most protected terrorist safe haven in the world in northern Mali. Sometimes people ask what I mean when I say that there was a safe haven or a terrorist safe haven in northern Mali. I mean, some of you may be familiar with the term. There's some debate, I think, in the scholarly literature about it. But what it means, I think, just in the most basic sense, is that Al-Qaeda had the run of the place. A huge, albeit sparsely populated area that was roughly the size of France. Belmokhtar and his associates could operate freely without the need for secrecy or fear for their lives there. They established Sharia in all the northern towns of Mali, cut the population off from the capital in the south, established training camps, began destroying ancient cultural sites that they considered un-Islamic, and intensified their smuggling operations, and in the process began earning more and more money. Experts watched this safe haven grow from afar, and obviously with growing concern over the course of 2012. One of the most disconcerting elements about it, I think, was the fact that jihadists from other parts of the world were traveling there in order to take advantage of the training opportunities that existed and join basically what seemed like one of the coolest new jihadist communities in the world. So these foreign fighters who were coming to northern Mali in 2012 came mostly from elsewhere in Africa, but they also came from Pakistan, and most disconcerting for the French, from metropolitan France itself. In short, what was emerging in northern Mali back in 2012 looked a lot like the safe haven that existed in Afghanistan before the 9/11 attacks, a place where terrorists could gather and train and finance their operations with impunity. Even more important, I think from the perspective of drawing historical lessons, northern Mali in 2012 had started to look a lot like Syria and Iraq in 2014, albeit again on a somewhat smaller scale. As with Daesh in Syria and in Iraq today, AQIM-controlled territory had established extreme Sharia, set up training camps, foreign fighters were coming in, as I said a minute ago, and frankly, the international community was divided over how best to handle this growing problem. Everybody knew it was a bad thing that was going on in Mali, but no one was exactly sure what to do about it. So this was one of those situations so common in foreign affairs where pretty much everyone in the international community, that is, agreed that there was a big problem in Mali, but no one thought it was quite big enough to tackle on their own. The French seemed like the last country of all of the countries that were looking at intervention in Mali that was about to send in the military, especially to do so unilaterally, that is, outside of some kind of a broader framework. I mean, to begin with, as a former colonial power, France has a long-standing and complicated relationship with West Africa, and there was a lot of pressure on France to get out of West Africa, indeed to get out of Africa as a whole, and very little enthusiasm in France itself initially for getting more deeply committed in Africa. Moreover, as you no doubt recall, France was the country that had been most vociferous in its objections to the Iraq War. They had just started an early withdrawal of their troops from Afghanistan, and in addition, now they had a socialist politician, François Hollande, in power. So all of these things together suggested that France was very unlikely, I would say around about, certainly in early and even in mid-2012, to do anything militarily about this emerging safe haven in Mali. But as things deteriorated further over the course of the year, the debate in France started to shift toward taking some kind of military action and eventually toward taking unilateral military action. Several factors played in this shift, and then I uncovered these, I should note, through a long series of interviews in Paris with both people in civil society, but also with a number of high-level French civilian and military leaders who were kind enough to talk to me about the intervention and their decision-making. So some of these factors included France's long relationship with Mali, which I said was a reason to stay out, but at the same time it also created kind of a responsibility to go in. By opting out of the Iraq War, moreover, the French public was probably a little less jaded about military intervention as a whole than the publics in the UK, in the United States, and in some other European countries. There was also a certain eagerness in the French military to prove its value against terrorist threats. And I think a perception in Paris that I think was probably right, that Washington wasn't ready to do much about this challenge and really wanted to see France begin to carry its own water in dealing with threats like Al-Qaeda. Most important, though, I mean, all of these things played a role in French thinking about why it was important to do something about Mali. But the most important thing was just the simple fact that the French genuinely felt threatened by the emergence of its safe haven in their former colony. France had recently been hit by a spate of very gruesome murders at the hands of a man who had terrorist training in Pakistan and potentially elsewhere. And the possibility that French citizens might be going to Mali for terrorist training was cause for very significant concern. Still, over the course of 2012, the French worked with the United States and other powers to get some kind of an international multilateral strategy in place. In December, the UN Security Council authorized an international force to stabilize northern Mali. The general expectation was that this force would deploy at some undetermined date later, hopefully in 2013, but no one was really sure if it would even get there in 2013. So what happened, however, was completely different. Less than a month after the UN agreement, just a matter of weeks, in early January 2013, several columns of well-armed jihadists started massing in trucks along the Niger River. The Niger now is the physical barrier that separates northern Mali from southern Mali. And up to this time, the jihadis had pretty much stayed north of the river. They've been more or less happy to do that over the course of 2012. But in the second week of January, it looked like they were starting to plan a potential push south across the river. Alarm bells started going off in Paris. Then on Friday, the 11th of January, several hundred of these jihadists crossed the Niger and started speeding towards the capital, which was highly vulnerable on account of the fact that Mali's security forces had all but collapsed when the jihadists took over the north the year before. Bamako's civilian population was highly exposed. It was really hugely vulnerable to anything that the jihadis might have hoped to do to them. This was the point at which the French changed course and decided to send in their military. That afternoon, I'm talking about Friday, the 11th of January, a French Special Forces unit operating from northern Burkina Faso flew in and attacked the column of jihadists. This was only a handful of men that we're talking about here, flying in very exposed conditions against enemy forces that were known to have effective, at least tactical military training. Attacking from their Gazelle helicopters, the French managed to kill several of the jihadists and disperse the remainder of them, break up their column that was advancing on Bamako. Jihadists were stopped, but the French lost a pilot of one of their aircraft in the raid. Over the course of the next 72 hours, French forces from across Africa surged into Mali. Within hours of the Special Forces raid, French fighter jets flying from Chad and France itself started attacking jihadist targets across the whole country. Simultaneously, a small contingent of about 50 French paratroopers from Chad flew into Bamako. A few hundred more in Côte d'Ivoire were ordered into their vehicles to start a 1,400-kilometer drive all the way up to Bamako. A contingent of similar size, a few hundred more, meanwhile deployed via air from metropolitan France itself. General Barrera, who would command the tactical aspects of this operation and was very helpful to me in my research for this book, I think tellingly describes the sort of feeling of being 1 minute sledding with his kids in France in the middle of January, obviously, and then just a few hours later, it seems like, sitting on the steaming tarmac of the airport in Bamako, just a sort of real shift of worlds. Anyway, thanks to these initial very quick muscle movements, France had some 800 troops in Mali within a matter of just a few days. No sooner had they arrived there than they started a helter-skelter charge northward across the desolate terrain toward the Niger River. Further forces, meanwhile, started flowing in behind them, and within a week, the French had secured all the major towns south of the Niger River, in other words, all of southern Mali. Now, however, they faced a really difficult set of strategic choices. They could order French forces to dig in and just hold the south. This would be effectively cordoning off the north and returning to the status quo from before the jihadists had launched their attack across the Niger. And this would have been, by far and away, I think, the safest option for the French to take. In some ways, I think politically it was probably the logical option. Alternatively, they had the option of moving across the Niger River to try to retake the main jihadist-held towns in the north, especially Gao and Timbuktu, which were really considered the two most important, but at the same time leave the lesser towns and the more remote towns in the far north in al-Qaeda hands, in the hands of al-Qaeda's allies. Finally, the third option was to try and clear the north entirely, flush all of the al-Qaeda and their allies out, retake the whole territory, eject the terrorists, and this was obviously the riskiest of all of the options that they had. It was, nevertheless, the option that President Hollande ultimately picked, I think to the surprise of some of his advisors. He ordered French forces to move with the utmost speed into the north and chase al-Qaeda out once and for all. The French military, as you might expect, responded very quickly to this. By early February, they had retaken Gao, Timbuktu, and the key towns in the northernmost reaches of the country, the towns where the jihadists had stronghold had been deepest and longest standing. You remember I mentioned where they had intermarried with different tribes. In liberating each of these towns, the French proceeded in a similar kind of a pattern. Special forces conducted an initial raid, chasing most of the jihadists out. Then conventional forces moved in rapidly behind the SOF in order to secure the town. It's worth noting that there was a significant risk of ambush that greatly concerned the French military leadership, especially in the early weeks of their operation. This is because Mali's enormous, it's just simply because Mali's is enormous, and in their rapid push northward into the desert, French logistics lines tended to get very, very strung out and exposed. Given the extreme conditions in the region, where heat was rising above 100 degrees on nearly all the days that they were operating there, the possibility that French troops would die of exposure if these supply lines were cut off was quite real. A simple ambush along one of these lines, which sometimes just couldn't be well protected, could have meant, as a result, a major calamity for their French troops that were furthest in the north. Needless to say, not a few French soldiers who I had the pleasure of talking to pointed out how extreme the operating environment was. The conditions in northern Mali were very, very difficult. French forces slept under the stars, without modern luxuries, with limited food and water, often carrying extremely heavy loads in what was really extreme heat. Sometimes the most nutritious food that they had to eat was actually onions. Dysentery was, needless to say, rife. By early February, French forces were in control of several towns in the north. One final task remained, however, after having retaken the south and taken the major towns in the north. This was to clear the mountainous region of the northwest known as the Ifoghas Mountains. The Ifoghas sit in an extremely remote location along the border with Algeria in Niger. It's well known that many of the jihadists had fled the towns of the north in order to take shelter in the mountains, which they had been preparing and fortifying as a fallback for many months and potentially for years. Unlike the first phases of the operation, which went very quickly, in the Ifoghas, the French had to go very slowly and on foot, rock by rock, basically, to root out the remaining al-Qaeda troops. One French official described this as using une fourchette à l'escargot, an escargot fork, in order to pick out the tiny pockets of remaining resistance as they moved across the Ifoghas Mountains. So, by early April, we're talking only 3 months after their initial intervention, French forces were able to start drawing down. To be sure, they'd remain in Mali and in the broader region in some form indefinitely. And I think it's important to point out that they're still in the region today. This is a good thing. At the height of the operation, French troop levels reached some 4,500. I don't need to tell you that this is a mere fraction of what the United States deployed in Iraq or in Afghanistan, where we deployed forces that numbered well over 100,000 at peak levels. Now, obviously, Mali is a very different case, and we have to be very careful in making comparisons between, or explicit or implicit, between what the French accomplished there and the challenges that the United States and its allies faced in Iraq and Afghanistan. But I think that the fact that the French were able to pull this off is noteworthy nonetheless. Obviously, like any military operation, what the French accomplished in Mali was not without some hiccups. I mean, not everything went well. A lot of the mistakes are in the book. I'm just not including them tonight. And I talk about these. Moreover, they certainly did not, in this operation, solve in a fell swoop the threat that's posed by Salafi jihadist groups in the region altogether. Far from it. I think it should be clear by what I said at the outset. That threat remains, it's significant, and it should be of concern. But obviously, to expect them to do that would have been, at least in my view, far too much to ask. It's to set the bar too high in judging their intervention and its success. The fact is, their operation was successful in many key regards. Think about this. Before their intervention, the Malian government had collapsed under a military coup. The north had been turned into one of the world's most threatening terrorist safe havens. The jihadis were headed for the capital, where they might have done all manner of horrific things to the civilian population. Only 3 months later, with less than 5,000 troops and at a cost of about $1 billion, the attack on the capital had been averted, the country was headed for democratic elections, and most importantly, the terrorist safe haven in the north had been destroyed. In the process, they'd killed hundreds, potentially more, al-Qaeda members and their associates. To me, that's a successful operation. So the question then is, what lessons can we draw from it, for France or for the United States? Well, when I started my remarks, I said there were 3 subjects that the book deals with: contemporary French military and defense policy, strategies for military operation, which work and which don't, and then finally the spread of violent jihadi groups across North Africa. So to conclude, let me just briefly comment on each of these. Regarding the French, I think 2 things are clear. One, this is a country that continues to aspire to be a military power that matters on the world stage. In an area where most U.S. allies are confronted with low levels of defense spending and limited capabilities, this should be welcome news. In Africa in particular, it's clear the French intend to continue to play a major military role in dealing with the jihadist threat we're all now facing on that continent. Second, doing this is going to be hard for the French. Despite their aspirations and demonstrated capabilities, the problems in Africa are major and getting worse. France alone isn't going to be able to cover down on the challenges stretching across Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Chad, Niger, Mauritania, and Morocco. They'll need, and they ought to get, U.S. support. So this brings me to my second subject, the lessons for military intervention. As I said a minute ago, the French managed to destroy a major jihadist safe haven, what was one and was threatened to become an even bigger one, thwart an assault on a major African city, restore Mali's territorial integrity, and kill lots of terrorists in the process. In doing so, they struck a tough blow to al-Qaeda in the region. They did all of this, as I said a minute ago, in a matter of months, with only 4,500 troops. Now, as I said, Mali is not Syria or Iraq. I said it's not Afghanistan or Iraq, but it's also not Syria and Iraq today. Daesh's numbers are 25 times more than al-Qaeda's were in Mali back in 2013. So I'm not saying you could have exactly the same effect in Syria and Iraq today with a similar size force. But I think the French intervention nevertheless did demonstrate at least 3 points that are relevant to strategy in Iraq and Syria now. First, acting rapidly, unexpectedly, and decisively against their foe had a huge benefit. The speed and force with which the French acted were totally unexpected by the al-Qaeda guys there, and this was a major benefit to their success. Second, the French did not plan to stay for very long, but they did plan for some kind of a stabilization force. In Libya, as some of you may know, the absence of a stabilization force has led to very unsatisfactory outcomes, to put it lightly. But staying on too long by the same token after an intervention can create problems of its own, as many analysts have noted. In Mali, the French appear to have squared this circle by shifting responsibility for post-conflict stabilization over to another force, and in particular to the UN. Third, and on the most basic level, in an era where many NATO countries are reticent about military intervention, the French demonstrated that the use of the military tool could actually be effective. To be sure, military forces are only part of the solution of the problem, like the one that Mali faced in 2013, and understanding when they're appropriate and when they're not is going to remain a major challenge for scholars and policymakers alike as we look out into the future. Moreover, mind you, and I want to emphasize this, Mali is not Switzerland today. I mean, far from it. The situation there, even now, is far from good. Not even all of the terrorist groups are eradicated. They've come back to some degree in some areas. But as I said a minute ago, it's unquestionably better than it was before the French intervened. With continued support from the international community, I think there's a toehold there to help address the broader problem of Salafi jihadist groups that I described at the outset. A lot more needs to be done to deal with this problem. But understanding what the French did and are continuing to do in their war on al-Qaeda in Africa seems to me to be an essential starting point for our own strategy and policy toward this increasingly problematic region. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
My name is Matthew O'Sullivan. I'm an associate at Cross-Boundary. We're an investment advisory firm that's currently operating an investment facilitation program in Mali with the help of USAID. When I was in Bamako a couple weeks ago, much of the talk of the town was about the drug trafficking that's continuing to go on in the north, and how that is really helping to fuel much of the banditry that seems to have replaced the extremism. And I'm hoping that you can talk a little bit more about that root issue of trafficking in the region, and as well about how banditry has taken the place of extremism as an outlet for grievances and as just an activity as well for people who are not economically involved. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely, Matthew. I think that's a really good point that you make, and I didn't develop it in my remarks. It's in the book. I think that the most important thing about what you're pointing to there is the fact that these Salafi jihadist groups and terrorist elements coexist in a very symbiotic way with these criminal elements. I mean, there's something of a significant debate actually about whether AQIM should be considered to be a terrorist group or should be considered to be a criminal group. I mean, the reality is that it was both. And at some point, the argument about whether it was mainly a terrorist group or mainly a criminal group became not all that important, because it was a terrorist group that had apocalyptic visions for what it wanted to do in the region, that was also deeply involved in cigarette smuggling, drug smuggling, kidnapping, and all other kinds of smuggling operations. So these two things go very closely together. I think the financing that they gain from these operations is hugely problematic, because it allows them to recruit not only more foot soldiers, but also higher quality foot soldiers. They can pay people more. They can give people more to hope for. It's not the only reason why people will go and join a group like AQIM, but anyone who tells you that it doesn't make a difference, I think, is just wrong. Also importantly, it allows them to buy off government officials that they need to buy off in order to conduct both, to continue their smuggling, and then also to conduct the kind of guerrilla and terrorist attacks that they seek to conduct in order to achieve their larger goal, which is, of course, to establish a caliphate across Algeria and the broader region. So it's a great question.
So my question is, what can France do to improve the capacity and the efficiency of local African forces? Thank you.
So my view on improving the capacity of local African forces is this is absolutely essential. It's something that's going to take, 50 years. I mean, this is not something that's happening, very soon. I mean, the French had already invested significantly in training forces in Mali, and also more significantly in other countries around the region, as you may be aware, Daniel. But the fact of the matter is that the level of development is so low that training forces to do things that you would take for granted with a European recruit, you just can't take for granted, like driving skills, reading and writing literacy, obviously, and some very basic things that you take for granted, even if you want to do basic training, just don't exist there. And this is a huge problem, and it's going to continue to be a problem, I'm afraid, for a long time. So I don't know that I certainly don't, if there's a silver bullet to strengthening the forces of Mali and other countries in the region, I don't know what it is, and I don't think anyone really knows what it is. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing it. I mean, it's absolutely critical, because at some point you really do want these countries to gradually, over time, be able to deal with these problems on their own. And part of what happened, and again, I recount this also in the book, that started the collapse of the government in early 2012 was that there was a force that had been trained to do operations in the north, and the Malians actually had way too much confidence in it. What they'd done was train a force that was very good at some tactical kind of things, far better than any force they'd ever had before, but they hadn't provided any of the logistical backbone or any administrative structures that it needed to be able to support itself. So when it got into trouble with the jihadists, when they came across the border from various different directions, they quickly were overrun, and there was no support, no backup for them whatsoever. It was a huge tragedy, and that's part of what led to the overthrow of the government and the breakdown of democracy. So even in trying to rebuild and strengthen these forces, there are a lot of risks, and there are a lot of lessons to be learned, including in Mali itself.
Lawrence Freeman. I work on economic research for Africa development for about 25 years. I write for Executive Intelligence Review, and I'm also on the Lake Chad Basin Commission Advisory Committee. I was in Mali, maybe June 2013. I don't know if you mentioned this in your book, but the fact of the matter is that wouldn't it be the case also that the causes in Mali, which I don't know if you identify, is, look, the regime change policy against Gaddafi was a disaster. And all the reports I got from the Malians I talked to, and I've been in Nigeria, northern Nigeria many times, is that this tremendously strengthened the hand of the terrorists and of Boko Haram and other groups. So you had these trained forces coming in from Libya, well armed, and this caused a major problem which increased the danger of northern Mali. The second issue, it seems to me, is related to the problem of northern Mali, is the absolute lack of any development. And there's nothing there. It's 2/3 of the country has 100 million people. There's no development whatsoever. And it seems to me the French and the West in general, the World Bank, the IMF, these guys have done nothing to develop this area with infrastructure, economic, energy, railroads. And even this meeting just took place in France, I guess a month ago. Pledges of a few billion euro, no concrete plans for development. This seems to be another cause. I went to the Office du Niger and looked at the potential development from Ségou in this major inland Mali delta, which could be developed to feed 2.5 million tons of rice if it was developed. So the question is, the French, as you're pointing out, was successful, although I think there's 3,500 French now over the entire region. I forgot what the program is closed, but Chad, Niger, Burkina Faso. But if the French don't actually deal with the development question, the northern Mali will always remain, maybe not a fully developed safe haven, but it'll always remain a place for the terrorists because they can easily operate. So these are important questions. I don't know if you address them or not, but I think they should be addressed.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think, so on the development question, I think that, let's see, I'm not in any way, shape, or form arguing that the military, and I hope I made this clear, that the military tool is sufficient to achieve success, and certainly not to achieve strategic success. In a country like Mali, if you don't have development, you're just going to have to intervene again and again and again and again. You're not going to get anywhere. Now, some people would argue, well, that's the reality in Mali. It's always going to be that way, so we are going to have to intervene again and again and again. I'm a little bit more hopeful than that. I think development is going to take a long time. You're the expert, you tell me, but I know it's not going to happen overnight. But absolutely, development in the north is essential. Just providing basic services to the people who live there is going to reduce the chances that they revolt again and create the opening for al-Qaeda to come in and take advantage of the situation. So I couldn't agree more on that. Regarding the civil war in Libya, I think that's a little bit more difficult of a thing. I mean, there's no question that it had some impact. You know, the Tuaregs who revolted were basically Gaddafi's henchmen, and when they saw, you know, the tide turning against Gaddafi, they all up and left, and they came back to Mali. Now, that said, a lot of them were revolutionaries in Mali before they went to Gaddafi, and you've had this kind of problem with the Tuaregs in Mali since the 1960s. So it's not like the civil war in Libya actually created that, although I think you can make the argument that it was a contributing factor, and I have a discussion about that in the book as well.
Hello, my name is Kevin Newalk. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm an analyst at the Department of Defense. I wanted to ask about during your discussions with the French military officials, did they say that they had institutionalized any lessons learned from the French-Algerian War and fighting FLN at that time? And then secondly, how does France see Algeria in this conflict and the stabilization efforts? Thank you.
Okay, good questions. I think that if you're talking about the Algerian, you mean the Algerian War of the 50s and 60s, yeah, I mean, I think it's almost beyond lessons learned, right? That's such a formative experience for the French military that I never asked them whether or not they've actually done lessons learned on it, but it's such a critical, you know, it's like Vietnam for the United States, so absolutely had to have a huge impact. How they see Algeria today is actually kind of interesting. I mean, a way that someone described it to me is that Algeria for them is kind of like, this is a little bit not entirely accurate, it's kind of like Pakistan for the United States, right? It's the difficult partner that you kind of wish you didn't have to deal with, but is absolutely crucial to achieving your strategic objectives in the region. I think that over the course of this operation, you saw, especially after the In Amenas attacks, which occurred really within the first week of French operations, you saw a shift in attitudes within the Algerian government itself about what they were willing to let happen in terms of their airspace, in terms of operations, in southern Algeria. So I think that, the Algerians have, for historical reasons, obviously a really complicated relationship with France. I think that, and this is even more broadly than the Mali case itself, you can be hopeful that there's a gradual sort of shift in thinking within Algeria itself about the need to, to deal with this broader region in a cooperative kind of way that maybe does involve some outside influence that they have historically been so allergic to. But of course, as you know, also Algeria's got a lot of succession issues right now, economic problems, and so it's kind of uncertain.
My question tonight is, you mentioned that AQIP, they intermarried a lot with the Tuareg group, and I was wondering what Mali's government could do to maybe address some of the Tuareg's grievances so that they don't climb in bed again, literally.
Yeah. No, that's a good question, Elizabeth. Economic development, I think, is at the top of the list, right? I mean, people living in, very extreme conditions without any presence of the state providing any kind of services for them. How can you expect people like that to be loyal, to Bamako, which is, thousand kilometers away? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. And the elites in Bamako have a tendency to view the Tuaregs, for historical reasons, as marauders, dangerous, villainous people. And there's a lot of skepticism about, whether or not they really ought to be investing in developing the North. So one of the sort of ongoing dialogues that happens between countries like France and the United States and the elites in Bamako is to tell them, yeah, it's worth investing in the North. They're not all Al-Qaeda. These are, people who are living under difficult circumstances, and you got to do what you can to try and provide some basic services for them, because if you don't do that, this problem is not going to go away. But it's a tough conversation, I think.
I was curious, just in terms of your research, whether you found, because of the incident, whether the U.S., the Brits, and the French have actually gotten together in terms of lessons learned in terms of how they share military assets. Because I think a lot of what goes on is beg, borrow, and stealing in terms of just trying to improvise to how to actually meet the contingencies.
On the whole, this has been a very positive experience for Franco-American relations in a couple of ways. I think, first of all, with special forces, the French and the United States have been working together closely on SOCOM, and the French equivalent have been working fairly closely together for a year or more, really dating back to, I would say, a few years in Afghanistan, and they've been developing a closer relationship. And this was something that I think both sides that I talked to felt really paid off in Mali. So that's a definite plus, and there's enthusiasm, I think, for that as you look ahead. More broadly, the United States, a lot of countries, supported France in this effort, not with ground forces or with any kind of attack forces, but the United States was one of the countries that provided, important enablers. The U.S. provided lift, provided refueling, and provided ISR. And I asked the French general, who's now the commander of their special forces, which of those was the most important. And he said to me, they're all important. We were grateful to have them all. But what really mattered in the early days was the refueling, because we were very limited in our refueling capacity, and keeping close air support over those logistical lines that I described was extremely hard for us. So they were, in the early days of the operation, unable to have that because they lacked the refueling capability. So when the U.S. came in with the refueling capability, they started being able to keep 24/7 cover on their convoys as they moved north. And this gave them it really reduced the risk and the strain on their forces. But over the duration of the operation, he said what was most important was actually ISR. It was the ISR that the U.S. was able to provide. So I think that relationship, there was some initial, and I described the sort of back and forth about who should pay, and we're not UPS, and there were all these comments that were thrown around. But over time, I think that it's actually been a positive sort of learning experience for both sides.
In the court of public opinion, how important would it be to listen to and invest in the voices within the Muslim community to divest ISIL and Al-Qaeda of religious significance and authority?
So this is in the field of countering violent extremism, as we call it now, and my own view is that, yeah, it's really important. I'm not a great expert in the methods that are being used for strategic communication in order to do that, but I think that's definitely an avenue that ought to be pursued and is being pursued. I don't know if it's being pursued as effectively and robustly as it might be. I'm just not in a good position to judge.
I was wondering if you could talk more about, considering the ethnic and political tensions in North Africa, how does Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb recruit its followers? What strategies does it use? Who does it recruit, and how does it inspire them, given the context of all of this instability and France's colonial history in the region?
So the methods, the recruiting methods are real and increasingly established, I think. They involve basically preying on young men who are marginalized from society for various reasons, and bringing them into what is effectively a brotherhood that gives new meaning to their lives, and indoctrinating them into a vision of the world that is compatible to in some ways with what they were brought up with. In many cases, these are conservative, young men who have some of the ideas, but they don't have the violent strategy that goes along with it. But then, teaching them that violent strategy is, not only justified, but the only solution to the problems that are out there in the world, which they themselves feel because of their social marginalization. So the question, in part, is, how do you stop those agents? There's an element of agency here. There are people who are out there looking for those guys and trying to get them. But there's also a broader structural problem, which is why you have this phenomenon in North Africa. And this is part of what I was alluding to early on in my talk, which is that you have a broad range of different social and economic factors in the region that create this sense of alienation. Now, the most obvious one is simply, you're just really poor and you can't get food, But that's not necessarily the most prevalent one. It can be, like I said, I was just in Tunisia, and there you have different kinds of you see people who are becoming foreign fighters for different reasons, and one of them might be they're just very, very poor, but another might be that they're actually from a sort of mid-level kind of a family. They went to university, they got a master's degree, they're 22 years old, but it turns out that their master's degree is totally worthless. They can't find a job. Their family doesn't have any connections to get them a job in a society that's very clientelistic. And everything that they've been promised turns out to be basically phony. And that's another, these aren't poor people. They're people who are marginalized from economic opportunity, though. So what that means is if the economy in the region is going to grow, this is important, as we were talking about a minute ago, but it's not necessarily going to solve all of the recruitment opportunities that the AQIM recruiters or the Daesh recruiters or the recruiters for the other Salafi jihadist groups in the region are able to feed on.
My name is Stephanie Misar, and I'm a global media consultant stationed here in Washington, D.C. What was the overall public perception of the average French citizen of becoming involved in the whole everything you described?
So I also have a section on this, actually. It was fickle. I mean, I think like public opinion in any country, public opinion in France went up and down with the fortunes of the operation. At the beginning, there was a lot of talk about, we're not going to go back into Africa. This is, more French imperialism. We need to stop that. But then as people watched what was happening, the Sharia people being implemented, people having their human rights violated, things being, cultural heritage sites being destroyed, plus on top of the fact of this concern about foreign fighters potentially coming back to France itself, a problem that France now actually has in a significant way today, public opinion started to shift and get behind the government when it finally intervened. Now that's not to say that there wasn't, after the initial intervention, the French public, I don't remember the exact figures, there's more than half of the French public in polling that supported it in the initial days and weeks. That's not to say that there were not important voices that spoke out against it. Dominique de Villepin, for example, who had lambasted the United States for its intervention in Iraq, was one of those voices. I mean, he basically, speaking from the right of the conservatives of the French political spectrum, wrote, an op-ed that had a big impact in which he said, he accused the President Hollande of being George Bush, which sort of, the worst accusation you can imagine. In France, I'm talking about. That's not my own political view, but anyway, in French political context, that's anyway. De Villepin, wrote this op-ed. There were others like him who attacked it, but nevertheless, public opinion was fairly high, and I think it evolved over time, as all public opinion does, and I think that it remains fairly high today, actually, about what the French accomplished. It certainly does within the French military. I'll tell you that they're very, very proud, and I think with good reason of what they did. I think France as a whole, because it's seen as a success. I mean, ultimately, that's what drives whether or not the public views these interventions as good things or not, is whether or not they turn out to work.
Given France's involvement, and going off of the answer to the last question, when some people assumed that Hollande was going into Mali because for domestic purposes, but it's been successful. What likelihood is there for the French to become more involved in other places, whether it's in the heart of Africa or in Afghanistan or in Asia?
Yeah, so Hollande did get a bump from the intervention in terms of his own popularity, although it went back down again later. I think that my conclusion after looking at this and talking to so many different people in the French civilian and military leadership is that France is convinced that it has to play a role at least in Africa, and particularly in North Africa. I think it's also demonstrated that it's willing to play a role of certain kinds, maybe not with ground forces, but certainly with air power in Iraq and Syria, and it's going to continue to do that. And then it also sees a role for itself, certainly with air power, and I can imagine potentially with ground forces in reinforcing NATO positions in Eastern Europe. I mean, part of this is just a traditional French way of strategic thinking and a French belief that France is a great power. In order to remain a great power, it's got to have a strong military. It's got to exercise it, it's got to use it, and it's got to use it to protect the interests of France and of France's European partners. Now, I don't think that you're going to see France eager to intervene in South Asia or in Asia itself. I think there's a sort of feeling that they did Afghanistan. It didn't go as well as they would have hoped. And their decision is sort of in a typical French kind of, splitting the difference kind of way, is that it doesn't mean that they're completely retract and not deploy military power overseas, which after all is in keeping with their national traditions. But they're going to do it in a more limited kind of a way, closer to Europe, where they feel their interests are most threatened. After all, there's plenty of problems, if you've been reading the news, just around the periphery of Europe right now these days, and I think it's going to keep them occupied for a long time to come.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Chivvis. Please join me in thanking him.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.